The year is 1347. A woman stands before a judge in Samarkand, and when they finally remove the iron mask from her head after 6 months, the crowd gasps. Her face is a map of suffering, dried blood crusted around her eyes, scars where metal pressed into skin day after day, and her gaze is different now. She's learned to look at the world through a tiny window, a 30-degree cone of vision, because looking anywhere else meant driving spikes into her own eyes. Her name is Fatima, and she's about to expose a conspiracy so calculated, so profitable, that it will shake an empire. But here's what will truly haunt you. She's not unique. Between the 9th and 18th centuries, historians estimate that 2,000 to 5,000 women endured this exact torture. And the crime that landed them in these masks? Looking. Just looking. This isn't a story about medieval barbarism or religious extremism, though that's how history has framed it for centuries. This is a story about money, about how societies weaponize morality to steal from women, and about one brave woman who refused to stay silent even when silence meant survival. What you're about to discover will change how you understand the relationship between oppression and profit, between honor and theft, between what we're told and what's actually true. To understand the Iron Mask, we need to travel back to the 9th century, to the heart of the Abbasid Caliphate, an empire stretching from North Africa to Central Asia, encompassing some of the most advanced cities on Earth. While Europe struggled through what we call the Dark Ages, Baghdad was building hospitals, universities, and the legendary House of Wisdom, a library that rivaled anything the modern world could imagine. This was the civilization that gave us algebra, advanced medicine, astronomical observations that would remain unchallenged for centuries. So, how could a society this intellectually advanced also produce a device designed to blind women for the crime of making eye contact? The answer lies in a concept called namus, loosely translated as honor, but not the kind you're probably imagining. This was a rigid, legalistic form of honor that treated a woman's gaze as property. In elite Persian society, a woman's eyes didn't belong to her. They belonged first to her father, then to her husband, then to her sons. To look freely, to meet the world with unrestricted vision, was considered a form of theft, stealing the right to see from the men who supposedly owned that right. This might sound like religious doctrine, but here's where it gets interesting. The Quran actually says nothing about restricting women's gaze to this extreme. This was cultural practice, Persian tradition mixing with selective interpretation of religious texts to create something new and horrifying. And buried in 9th century legal texts is where we find the smoking gun, a classification that defined iron masks not as torture devices, not as punishment tools, but as protective clothing. Let that sink in. The same legal framework that dictated modest dress also legalized a device specifically designed to mutilate, to turn the natural human instinct to look around, to react to movement, to see the world, into a slow, agonizing path toward blindness. Once that legal door was opened, cruelty walked freely through it. But the real genius, if we can use such a dark word, was in the engineering. The mask itself was a masterpiece of calculated horror. Imagine a shell of cold iron fitted perfectly to a woman's head, locked at the back where she couldn't reach. The interior was lined with 12 spikes, 6 aimed at each eye with terrifying precision. These weren't random points of metal thrown together by ignorant craftsmen. Each spike was positioned to stop exactly 3 millimeters from the cornea when the head was held perfectly still and the eyes looked straight ahead. 3 millimeters, roughly the width of 2 human hairs. That's the margin between safety and permanent injury. Can you imagine the psychological torture of living like that? Every moment requiring absolute control, fighting against every natural instinct. A child runs by and your head wants to turn to follow the movement. Can't do it. Someone calls your name from the side. Can't look. A bird flies overhead. Don't look up. Your foot catches on something. Don't look down. Any movement, any shift in head position, and those spikes would begin their work, piercing through the most sensitive tissue in the human body. Medieval physicians documented the results: corneal perforations, leaking aqueous humor, the fluid inside the eye, infections that sometimes spread to the brain. Many women died from these infections. Many more were left blind. But here's what's truly chilling. Some women survived with their sight intact. They mastered an inhuman level of stillness, learning to exist within that narrow 30-degree cone of vision for months or even years. Fatima was one of them. And her survival would eventually expose the real purpose behind these masks, a purpose that had nothing to do with morality and everything to do with money. Because when you start looking at who actually ended up in these masks and what happened to them afterward, a pattern emerges that's too consistent to be coincidence. Court records from the 1,330 seconds and 1,340 seconds reveal something disturbing. The women forced into iron masks were almost exclusively widows or recent divorcees who had inherited significant property. The supposed crimes that landed them in the masks seem absurd by any standard. Glancing at a merchant while buying fabric, making eye contact with a male pilgrim during Hajj, or even simply watching a public execution from too far away, where male guardians couldn't verify she was looking appropriately. No adultery, no actual improper behavior, just looking. The 14th century traveler Ibn Battuta documented seeing women in Persian markets shuffling along, guided by male relatives, their vision restricted by iron masks. When he inquired about their offenses, the answer was always the same: they looked. But here's the critical detail that historians missed for centuries. Most of these women had recently inherited wealth. They owned businesses, land, or trading contracts. And under Islamic law of the time, they had the legal right to manage that wealth themselves, as long as they were capable of doing so. Blindness, conveniently, meant they were no longer capable. When a woman lost her sight, guardianship of her property automatically reverted to male relatives, sons, brothers-in-law, or even business partners of their late husbands. Do you see the pattern forming? It's not about morality, it's about inheritance. A court record from 1,340 inches, Samarkand details 3 widows from the same wealthy merchant family. All 3 were accused of immodest gazes within 6 months of each other. All 3 were masked. All 3 suffered eye injuries. And all 3 had their late husband's businesses transferred to a single male cousin. The statistical probability of this being coincidence is essentially 0. This was systematic, calculated theft disguised as moral correction. For centuries, historians cataloged these cases under religious punishment or societal rigidity without ever asking the obvious follow-up question: who benefited financially? Enter Fatima al-Sarkandi in 1347. Her story begins like so many others. Her husband dies, leaving her 3 successful goldsmith shops and a trading contract worth what would today be roughly $2 million. Within 1 week of his death, her late husband's brother accuses her of making provocative eye contact with a customer. Multiple male witnesses, all with business connections to the brother, testify against her. She's convicted and masked. For 6 months, Fatima lives inside that iron cage, learning to identify people by voice and footsteps, navigating her workshops by memory, existing in that tiny cone of vision. Then, one day, a child runs through the courtyard and instinct takes over. She turns her head to track the movement. The spike pierces her left eye. The pain is immediate and excruciating. The infection that follows nearly kills her. But something else happens during those fever dream days of pain and antibiotics made from primitive herbal remedies. Fatima starts thinking. She remembers other wealthy widows she knew who mysteriously ended up masked. She recalls hushed conversations at the market about guardianship transfers. And when she finally recovers, partially blind in one eye, but alive and still mostly sighted, she makes a decision that will change history. She's going to fight back. She's going to expose the system. And she has 6 months of fury driving her. Fatima begins documenting everything. She interviews other women who survived the masks. She examines court records, looking for patterns. She traces property transfers. And what she uncovers is staggering. Over 5 years, 23 women in Samarkand alone, all wealthy widows, all accused by male relatives who stood to inherit, all masked by the same 3 court-appointed guardians. The pattern is undeniable, but the evidence that seals the case comes when Fatima discovers the receipts. In medieval Persia, meticulous records were kept of every transaction, including the purchase of protective clothing, the legal term for the masks. The receipts reveal that guardians paid enormous sums for these devices, roughly what a skilled craftsman would earn in 6 months. Why would anyone pay so much for a punishment device? Because it was an investment. The masks cost perhaps 500 dinars, but they secured inheritances worth 50,000 dinars or more. The return on investment was extraordinary. Even more damning. There were only 2 workshops in Samarkand authorized to produce these specific iron masks. Both were controlled by the same merchant guild, the same guild that many of the guardians belonged to. This wasn't isolated cruelty. This was organized crime operating under the cover of religious law. Fatima compiles all this evidence into a 14-page testimony and demands an audience with Sultan Abu Sa'id. The Sultan faces a crisis. If he ignores her evidence, he validates a system of fraud embedded in his own legal framework. If he acts, he risks angering powerful merchants and religious authorities who benefit from the system. But Fatima's evidence is too comprehensive, too undeniable. The financial records alone prove systematic conspiracy. In 1348, Sultan Abu Sa'id does something unprecedented. He issues a decree banning the iron masks entirely, declaring them instruments of false piety, tools that mask theft behind the facade of religion. All existing devices are to be destroyed immediately. Anyone who profited from guardianship obtained through masked women has those rights stripped. For a brief moment, it seems like justice has won. But here's the uncomfortable truth about systems built on oppression. They don't disappear just because you ban them. The practice went underground, continuing in rural areas beyond the Sultan's reach. Medical texts from the 1400s, 1500s, and early 1700s still mention women with mysterious eye injuries caused by traditional devices. The last officially documented case appears in 1687, more than 3 centuries after the Sultan's ban. A woman in a village outside Isfahan is blinded by a device her grandson later describes as traditional family correction. The masks had become part of local culture, their profit motive forgotten, their cruelty normalized as the way things are done. Fast forward to 2019. A private collector in Vienna acquires what he assumes is decorative armor at an estate sale. When he takes it to the Museum of Islamic Art in Berlin for appraisal, metallurgical testing reveals it's a 14th century Persian iron mask. The spikes are still perfectly calibrated, 3 millimeters from where the cornea would be, and etched on the inside, barely visible, are words in Arabic, "For the correction of the wayward gaze." It's physical proof that Fatima's story wasn't exaggerated, that these devices were exactly as horrible as the historical records claimed. The mask now sits in museum storage, too disturbing for public display, a silent witness to centuries of calculated cruelty. Fatima's courage exposed a system, but her story also illuminates something we need to understand about how oppression actually works. It doesn't usually announce itself as evil. It wraps itself in the language of morality, tradition, protection. The iron masks were legally classified as protective clothing. The guardians who stole women's inheritances claimed they were fulfilling religious duties. The craftsmen who built the devices were just following orders, making a living. Everyone had a justification, a reason why their role in the system wasn't really that bad. And that's how systematic oppression persists. Not through obvious villains, but through ordinary people convincing themselves that cruelty serves a higher purpose. The tools have changed, but these patterns haven't disappeared. Today we don't have iron masks, but we still have legal systems that make women's economic independence contingent on male approval, dress codes that claim to protect while actually controlling, traditions that restrict women's movement and choices in the name of honor or modesty. Fatima's story reminds us to ask the critical question that historians missed for 600 years. Who benefits? When any system restricts one group's freedom while claiming moral authority, look at who gains financially, who accumulates power, whose property gets redistributed. The answers are almost never what the official story claims. If this history disturbs you, if it makes you want to look deeper into how systems of oppression disguise themselves as tradition or morality, then subscribe to Flow of History. We're dedicated to uncovering the patterns that connect historical horrors to modern structures of control, to asking the questions that make power uncomfortable. Hit that notification bell, and let's continue exposing the truths that official histories tried to bury. Thanks for watching, and thanks for refusing to accept easy answers about why suffering exists.
Along with your gold.